Do you think you can tell fact from fear? One of these terrifying stories is true. Let's see if you're clever enough to guess which one it is. Story 1. The Babysitter's Final Night. It was a chilly Friday evening, and Emily had taken on a last-minute babysitting job for the Hendersons, a quiet family living in an old Victorian house on the edge of town. The house was grand, but had a certain darkness to it, with creaking floors and heavy curtains that seemed to hold in the shadows. But Emily didn't mind. She'd babysat there before, and the two kids, Lucy and Jack, were well behaved. As soon as the Hendersons left, Emily settled the kids in the living room with a movie and went to the kitchen to make popcorn. The house was eerily quiet, and Emily could hear the old pipes groaning as she waited for the popcorn to finish. Then, there was a knock at the front door. Emily frowned. The Hendersons had just left, and they weren't expecting anyone. She cautiously approached the door, peeking through the small glass window. No one was there. She opened the door a crack, just enough to look outside. The porch was empty, the night air cold and still. Emily shrugged, thinking it must have been the wind, and returned to the kitchen. A few minutes later, as she poured the popcorn into a bowl, there was another knock. This time it was louder, more insistent. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She hurried to the door, but again, there was no one there. The kids, sensing her unease, called out from the living room, asking if everything was all right. Emily forced a smile and reassured them it was nothing, just the wind. But the wind didn't knock. Emily was starting to feel uneasy. She checked the front porch again, this time stepping outside to look around. The street was deserted, and the surrounding houses were dark. She quickly retreated inside and locked the door, her mind racing. An hour passed, and the kids had fallen asleep on the couch. Emily was about to call the Hendersons to ask when they'd be home when she heard it again. A third knock, this time coming from the back door. Her blood ran cold. No one ever used the back door. She tiptoed to the kitchen, her heart pounding in her chest. The knocking continued, slow and steady. She grabbed a knife from the counter and approached the door. Through the small window, she could see a figure standing just beyond the porch light's reach. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, a dark silhouette against the night. Emily's grip tightened on the knife as she reached for the doorknob. Then, just as she was about to pull the door open, her phone rang, breaking the silence. She jumped and nearly dropped the knife. It was Mrs. Henderson. "Emily, thank God you answered." Her voice was frantic. "Listen to me very carefully. You need to get the kids and leave the house immediately." Emily's blood ran cold. "Why? What's wrong?" "There's a man who's been going around the neighborhood, breaking into houses. He hurts people. The police are looking for him, but they haven't caught him yet. We just heard from the neighbors that he was seen near our house earlier." Emily's heart pounded in her ears. She glanced back at the door, but the figure was gone. The knocking had stopped. Without another word, she hung up the phone, grabbed the kids, and bolted out of the house, leaving the lights on and the door wide open. They ran to a neighbor's house and pounded on the door until someone answered. The neighbor, an older woman, took them in and called the police. The police arrived within minutes and searched the house. They found nothing at first, no signs of forced entry, no trace of the man Emily had seen. But when they checked the backyard, they discovered something chilling, a set of muddy footprints leading up to the back door where the man had been standing. The prints stopped abruptly, as if the man had vanished into thin air. The Hendersons returned home later that night, shaken but grateful that Emily and the kids were safe. The man was never found, but rumors spread through the town about the old Victorian house, saying it was haunted by a dark presence that drove people to madness. Emily never babysat again after that night. Every time she passed by the Hendersons' house, she felt a cold shiver run down her spine, as if someone or something was watching her from the shadows. Story 2. The Last Call. I still remember the night I took that babysitting job. It was supposed to be a simple gig, nothing out of the ordinary. The Morgans had hired me a few times before, and their little boy Timmy was an easy kid. He was quiet, well-behaved, and never got in any trouble. It was a Saturday night, and the Morgans were heading to a late dinner with some friends. Amy gave me the usual rundown: emergency numbers on the fridge, snacks in the pantry, and Timmy's bedtime at 8:30. The house was older, a bit creaky, but charming in a way that old houses often are. I never felt uneasy there before. But that night, something was different, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. After the Morgans left, I played with Timmy for a while, then tucked him into bed right on time. He was asleep almost instantly, and I headed downstairs to the living room to settle in for a quiet evening. I had just started watching a movie when I heard it, a faint noise coming from upstairs. It was soft at first, like a gentle tapping, but it quickly grew louder. I muted the TV and listened. The noise was rhythmic, almost like someone was walking slowly down the hall. My first thought was Timmy. Maybe he'd gotten out of bed, so I went upstairs to check on him. When I reached his room, I found Timmy sound asleep, his little chest rising and falling steadily. The noise had stopped as soon as I reached the top of the stairs. I chalked it up to the house settling. It was old after all. I closed Timmy's door quietly and returned to the living room. About an hour later, just as I was getting comfortable again, the phone rang. It startled me, the shrill sound cutting through the silence of the house. I picked it up, expecting it to be the Morgans checking in, but the voice on the other end wasn't Amy's. "Is this the babysitter?" The voice was low, gravelly, and unfamiliar. "Yes. Who's this?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. There was a pause, then the voice spoke again. "Have you checked on Timmy?" My heart skipped a beat. "Who is this?" I demanded, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The line went dead. I stared at the receiver for a moment, my mind racing. Was this some kind of prank? I glanced at the clock. It was nearly 10 o'clock. The Morgans would be home soon. I just needed to keep calm. But something about that call unnerved me. I decided to go upstairs to check on Timmy again, just to be sure. When I opened the door to Timmy's room, my breath caught in my throat. His bed was empty. The covers were thrown back, and there was no sign of him. Panic surged through me as I rushed into the room, my eyes scanning every corner. "Timmy?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I checked under the bed, in the closet. Nothing. I could feel the fear clawing at my chest. Where could he have gone? The house was quiet, too quiet. Then I heard it again, the soft, rhythmic tapping coming from down the hall. I stepped out of Timmy's room, my heart pounding in my ears, and followed the sound. It led me to the attic door. The Morgans had told me the attic was off limits, just a storage space they never used. The door was slightly ajar, and the tapping was louder now, more insistent. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob. Slowly, I pushed the door open, revealing a steep, narrow staircase leading into darkness. The tapping echoed down from above, like someone or something was waiting. "Timmy?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. I didn't want to go up there, but I had no choice. I couldn't leave him alone in the attic. I took a deep breath and began to climb the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The air grew colder as I ascended, and the tapping grew louder, almost as if it was right next to me. When I reached the top, I fumbled for the light switch. The bulb flickered to life, casting long shadows across the dusty attic. There, in the corner, stood Timmy, his back to me, facing the wall. "Timmy?" I called softly. He didn't respond. I stepped closer, my pulse racing. "Timmy, what are you doing up here?" He slowly turned around, and I gasped. His eyes were wide, staring at something just past my shoulder. I whipped around, but the attic was empty. "Timmy, come on, let's go back downstairs," I urged, reaching for his hand, but he pulled away, shaking his head. "He's here," Timmy whispered, his voice trembling. "He's in the house." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "Who's here, Timmy?" There's no one else here. He told me to come up here, Timmy said, his voice barely above a whisper. He said he's been watching us. I grabbed Timmy's hand, pulling him towards the stairs. We're leaving right now. As we descended the stairs, the tapping started again, this time from directly behind us. I didn't dare look back. We raced down to the living room, and I grabbed the phone, dialing the police with shaking hands. As I waited for the call to go through, the tapping stopped. The house fell into a deep, suffocating silence. I glanced at the front door, considering making a run for it with Timmy, but just then, the front door swung open. It was the Morgans, laughing and talking as if nothing was wrong. Relief washed over me, but it quickly faded when I saw their faces. Their smiles disappeared when they saw how pale and shaken I was. What happened? Amy asked with a concern in her voice. I tried to explain, but before I could, the phone in my hand rang again. I glanced at the caller ID. It was the same number as before. My heart pounded as I answered. Is this the babysitter? The same gravelly voice asked. You should have checked the attic sooner. My blood ran cold as the line went dead again. I stared at the phone, my hands trembling. I never did figure out who was on the other end of that call or what they wanted. But after that night, I swore I'd never babysit again. The Morgans moved out a few weeks later, saying they needed a change. I never told them what really happened that night. Some things are better left unsaid. Story 3. The Babysitter's Secret. It was a quiet Saturday evening when I got the call. Mrs. Harper needed a babysitter for her 2 kids, Emma and Noah, and I was happy to help. They lived in a cozy little house at the end of Elm Street, where the trees cast long shadows on the lawn as the sun set. I'd babysat for them before, and it was always easy money. Emma was 10, old enough to keep herself entertained, and Noah, at 6, was a sweet, quiet boy. When I arrived, Mrs. Harper was already dressed up for her night out. We shouldn't be too late, she said with a smile as she grabbed her purse. Just make sure the kids are in bed by 9. No problem, I replied, waving as she and Mr. Harper left. The night started off as usual. We played a few games, watched a movie, and I made them some popcorn. By 8:30, both kids were yawning, so I sent them off to brush their teeth and get ready for bed. Emma, always the responsible older sister, led Noah upstairs while I tidied up the living room. As I was washing the dishes, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Noah standing in the doorway, his pajamas too big for his small frame, his eyes wide and serious. Can you close the closet door in my room? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I dried my hands on a towel and smiled. Of course, buddy, but why didn't you just close it yourself? He shook his head, taking a step back. I'm not supposed to. Mommy says I shouldn't close it. That was odd. Why wouldn't Amy want the closet door closed? But I didn't think much of it. Kids have strange fears, and sometimes parents just go along with them. I followed Noah upstairs, where Emma was already tucked in, reading a book. I went to Noah's room, and sure enough, the closet door was wide open, revealing rows of neatly hung clothes and a few toys scattered on the floor. I reached for the door handle, but Noah grabbed my arm. Please don't close it, he said, his eyes pleading. I paused. Why not? He glanced nervously at the closet. Because. He doesn't like it. A chill ran down my spine. Who doesn't like it? The man in the closet, Noah whispered. I felt a shiver of unease. Kids and their imaginations, I told myself. There was no man in the closet, just clothes and toys. But the look in Noah's eyes made me hesitate. I knelt down beside him. There's no man in the closet, Noah. It's just a shadow, maybe a jacket hanging up. Do you want me to check? He shook his head furiously. No, if you close it, he gets mad. Mommy says to always leave it open. My heart pounded a little faster. This wasn't just a kid's fear of the dark. This was something deeper. Something that scared Noah so much he couldn't even explain it. But I couldn't leave the door open. I couldn't let him think there was something to be afraid of in his own room. So I did what I thought was best. I smiled, trying to ease his fear, and said, "I'll tell you what. I'll close the door, and then I'll sit with you until you fall asleep. That way you'll know there's nothing in there." Before he could protest, I reached out and gently closed the closet door with a soft click. I tucked Noah into bed, his small hands clutching the blanket as if it were a shield. I sat beside him, humming a lullaby until his breathing slowed and his grip on the blanket loosened. Soon, he was fast asleep. I stayed in the room for a few minutes longer, watching his peaceful face, convincing myself that I'd done the right thing. I was about to get up and leave when I heard it, a soft, slow creaking sound. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the door inch open, the darkness inside the closet growing wider. I told myself it was just the house settling, the old wood expanding, anything to keep from panicking. But then I saw it. In the sliver of space between the door and the frame, there was something, a shadow, darker than the darkness of the closet itself. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if it knew I was watching. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My eyes were glued to that shadow, which seemed to stretch and grow, taking shape, becoming something almost human, but not quite. The door opened wider, and I saw a face. Not a man's face, but something twisted and wrong, with hollow eyes that stared back at me. A cold, cruel smile spread across its lips, as if it knew I had broken the rule. Then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, it spoke. "You shouldn't have closed the door." My body reacted before my mind could. I grabbed Noah, pulled him from the bed, bolted out of the room, and slammed the door behind me. I didn't stop running until we were downstairs in the living room, where Emma sat up, startled by the noise. "What's wrong?" she asked, her eyes wide with fear. I couldn't answer. I was too terrified, too shaken by what I'd seen or thought I'd seen. I held Noah close, trying to steady my breathing, trying to convince myself that it wasn't real, that I hadn't seen a face in the closet, that it was just a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination. But I knew better. When the Harpers came home, I didn't say anything about what had happened. I didn't want to scare them, didn't want them to think I was crazy. I just told them that Noah had a bad dream, and I stayed with him until he fell asleep again. Mrs. Harper thanked me, and as I was leaving, I couldn't help but ask, "Why do you keep the closet door in Noah's room open?" Her smile faded, and she looked away, almost as if she was ashamed. It's just easier that way. He doesn't like it when it's closed. Who doesn't like it?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. She hesitated, then met my eyes. "It's just better not to close it," she said softly, her voice tinged with fear. I left that house knowing one thing for sure. There are some doors that are better left open and some secrets that are better left undiscovered. I never babysat for the Harpers again, and I never closed another closet door without thinking twice. Sometimes, the monsters aren't just in your imagination. Which story do you think is based on true events? The Babysitter's Final Night, The Last Call, The Babysitter's Secret. The answer is The Babysitter's Final Night.